He was only 12. He entered the diner with a quiet confidence, clutching his grandmother's worn wallet tight in his pocket. The sun outside was fading. The smell of fry grease and stale coffee hung in the air. He didn't expect this day to change everything. Then, without warning, a hand cracked across his cheek, a loud slap that snapped the air. In that heartbeat, time froze. Crowds hushed. A ketchup bottle rattled on a table. The boy's eyes widened, tears caught in the corner. And in that silence he looked up, at his assailant, and something in him shifted. He thought it was just another bully, another powerless kid to humiliate. But he couldn't know who was watching from the shadows. He couldn't fathom the storm that was about to come. The man who would find him, who would return the strike with interest, controlled half the city. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was that boy? What would drive a teenage bully to cross the line? And how would the world shift when he discovered who the boy's father really was? To understand that night, we have to go back. Before the slap, before the silence, before the headlines, there was a boy named Miguel. He lived with his grandmother in a modest two-room house on the edge of town where the railroad tracks hummed softly at night. His father was a ghost. The kind of man people mentioned only when they were sure no one else could hear. The only thing Miguel had of him was a photograph, a faded Polaroid of a tall man in a suit, hand resting on the shoulder of a woman whose smile didn't reach her eyes. He would stare at that picture sometimes, tracing the outline of the man's face with his finger, wondering what kind of father left his son behind in a city full of predators. His grandmother, a gentle woman named Rosa, always said the same thing when he asked, "Your father is busy, mijo. He works with important people." But Miguel noticed how her hands trembled when she said it, how she would change the subject and hum softly to fill the silence. He didn't know what important really meant, only that it seemed to carry a kind of sadness in her voice. At school, Miguel kept to himself. He wasn't weak, just quiet. The kind of quiet that made louder kids nervous because they didn't know what to make of it. And one of those louder kids was Derek. Derek Taylor was 16, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of teenager who'd already learned that fear could get him almost anything. His father drove trucks for a living. His mother worked nights. And Derek learned early that being cruel earned him attention when love didn't. He didn't think of himself as a bully. He thought of himself as someone who taught lessons. He ruled the high school hallways with a smirk and a shove. Everyone knew him, everyone avoided him, and that made him feel alive. The diner was his kingdom, a place where waitresses laughed at his jokes, and other kids followed his lead because they were too afraid to stand against him. But that day, something felt different. The boy he mocked didn't flinch. When Derek shoved him, Miguel's eyes didn't dart away. They met his, steady, almost pitying. It wasn't defiance, not exactly, more like quiet endurance, the kind that comes from growing up around the kind of danger most kids never imagine. Miguel didn't know the details of his father's business, but he'd heard the whispers at night, names like Delgado, the docks, protection money. He knew enough to stay silent, and silence in Derek's world was the one thing he couldn't tolerate. That's how it began, not with rage but with insecurity. A boy who needed to feel powerful, and another who had power in his blood, but didn't understand it yet. In a city like theirs, the two were destined to collide. The diner just happened to be the stage. But while Derek laughed and his friends egged him on, someone else was there. Someone who wasn't supposed to be. A man in a dark suit, stirring his coffee slowly in the corner booth, eyes fixed on the reflection in the window. That man's name was Anthony Delgado. To the public, he was a contractor, a businessman who helped rebuild the city after the old factories shut down. But to those who knew, to those who'd seen what happened when you crossed him, he was something else entirely. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. When he entered a room, silence followed. And in that diner, as Derek's laughter echoed, Anthony's hand froze above his cup. The boy with the bruised cheek, his boy, was standing right there. The diner was small, but the weight of that moment would reach far beyond its walls. Anthony had built an empire out of patience, out of strategy, out of fear, but nothing, not power, not money, not even loyalty, could quiet what he felt when he saw Miguel touch the red mark on his face. For the first time in years, the man who controlled everything lost control. Now imagine you were that father, hearing that your child had been humiliated in front of strangers. How far would you go to make it right? Would you walk away trusting that life balances its scales, or would you make sure the world remembered your name before sunrise? Because for Anthony Delgado, justice wasn't something you waited for. It was something you made. And soon everyone in that small American town would learn exactly what that meant. That Friday afternoon started like any other, the kind of late spring day where the air felt heavy, the kind that made time move slower. The diner was half full, truckers on their lunch break, couples sharing fries, an old jukebox humming softly in the background. Miguel walked in after school, his backpack hanging off one shoulder, still wearing his hand-me-down jacket that didn't quite fit. He'd come to pick up an order for his grandmother, a burger and a slice of apple pie, simple, ordinary. He had no reason to expect that his life was about to change forever. At the corner booth sat Derek and his friends, loud, laughing, drowning out the music with stories about parties and fights that never happened. They noticed Miguel almost instantly. Derek leaned back in his seat, that same arrogant grin stretching across his face. "Hey," he called out, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "Look who's back. The charity case." The laughter that followed wasn't from humor. It was from power, the kind that feeds off fear. Miguel said nothing. He'd learned silence was safer. But that day, silence didn't save him. He walked to the counter, eyes forward, pretending the words didn't sting. He handed over a few crumpled bills, waited for the paper bag to be filled and tried to leave. But Derek wasn't done. He wanted an audience. He wanted control. "What? Too good to say hi now," Derek said, standing up. His friends quieted, their eyes darting between the two boys. The waitress froze behind the counter, uncertain whether to intervene. Miguel turned slightly, just enough to meet Derek's eyes. "I just want to go home," he said softly. And that's when Derek stepped forward, close enough to smell the grease and sweat in the air, close enough for Miguel to see the gold football ring glinting on his hand. The slap came without warning, a hard, open-handed strike that echoed through the diner. Miguel stumbled, the paper bag falling from his hand, fries scattering across the floor. For a second, nobody moved. Derek stood there, breathing heavily, trying to look tough, but his voice shook when he said, "Next time, learn some respect." The room fell silent. The sound of a fork dropping somewhere in the back was the only thing that broke the tension. And then, something changed. Miguel didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just looked at Derek, his eyes steady, unblinking, as if he'd seen something deeper behind the boy's anger. Something pitiful. That look unsettled Derek more than any punch could have. But what neither of them knew was that a man had been watching from the corner booth. His untouched coffee still steaming, his jaw clenched so tight his knuckles had turned white. Anthony Delgado had come to that diner for a meeting. He wasn't supposed to be there long. Just coffee, a handshake, a few quiet words about a construction deal. But when he saw his son's face, red, trembling, humiliated, something inside him cracked. He didn't shout or stand up. He simply placed a few dollars on the table, adjusted his tie and walked out without a word. Hours later, when the police were called about a missing teenager, no one thought to connect the two events. Derek's friends claimed they last saw him walking home after the diner incident. But the waitress, a woman named Carol, remembered something different. She said she saw two men in dark coats follow Derek outside, their faces hidden beneath baseball caps, their movements calm, practiced. She remembered thinking it was strange, how quiet they were, how deliberate. That night, the town slept uneasy. The slap had been loud, but the silence that followed was louder. Derek didn't show up at school the next day. His friends stopped talking. Miguel stayed home, his grandmother pacing the living room, phone clutched in her hand, fear in her eyes. Not fear for what had happened, but fear of what might come next. Because in a city like theirs, retribution had a rhythm. It didn't rush. It waited. It planned. And when it arrived, it was precise. Like clockwork. What would you have done if you were in Anthony Delgado's shoes? If you saw your child hurt in front of strangers, mocked, belittled, struck, would you have walked away? Or would you have let the city remember that every action has a price? Because for Anthony, this wasn't about revenge. It was about balance, a lesson taught once and never forgotten. And as the sun rose over that quiet American town, the first whispers began to spread. Derek Taylor was gone, and no one, not even the police, seemed to know where. The morning Derek's mother called the police, the town woke up to a different kind of silence, the kind that presses against your chest and makes every sound feel out of place. Patrol cars rolled through Maple Avenue, their lights flashing across manicured lawns and quiet porches. Reporters hadn't come yet. Rumors always arrive first. They said Derek had gotten into a fight. They said he'd run off. Some whispered that he'd joined one of the local gangs on the south side. But by the end of that first week, when his phone was found in a dumpster behind the diner, its screen cracked, its SIM card missing, people stopped guessing out loud. They started locking their doors earlier instead. Detective Carl Benton was assigned to the case, a 20-year veteran of the department known for his calm, deliberate approach. He'd seen missing kids before. Most turned up within 48 hours. But something about this one felt off. The witnesses' stories didn't match. The security camera that faced the alley behind the diner had conveniently stopped working that night. And when Benton tried to pull the maintenance log from City Hall, he found it had been accidentally misplaced. He paid a visit to Miguel and his grandmother. Their house sat on the edge of town, small, tidy, the kind of place where the floors still creaked and the walls held onto the smell of old wood and laundry detergent. Miguel barely spoke during the interview. His hands trembled when Benton asked about that night. He said Derek hit him, yes, but he didn't see what happened afterward. He'd gone straight home. That was all he knew. The boy's eyes said more than his words, eyes that carried both guilt and fear. Later that evening, Benton sat in his car, parked across the street, watching the lights flicker inside that small house. Something about the scene didn't sit right. It wasn't the boy. It was the stillness of it all, as if the family knew something. But silence was the safest option. In a town like theirs, silence had value, sometimes more than truth. 2 weeks later, Derek's car was found at the edge of the river, empty, the keys still in the ignition. The local news stations swarmed the scene. Anchors used words like mystery and tragedy while avoiding the ones that mattered: fear, power, control. The police chief ordered everyone to stay calm. But Benton noticed something no one else did: tire tracks leading away from the river, not toward it. Someone had staged the scene. Someone who wanted the story to end there. When Benton pulled the diner's financial records, one name appeared repeatedly: Delgado Construction. Payments, maintenance contracts, repairs. All legitimate on paper, but far too generous for a small-town diner. And when he asked the owner about it, the man's hands started shaking. "It's just business," he said quietly. "Mr. Delgado. He helps out when we need it." Anthony Delgado, a name that carried weight in that city. The kind of man whose presence was always felt, even when he wasn't in the room. People said he was trying to go straight, that he'd left the old ways behind. But Benton knew better. Men like Delgado didn't retire. They adapted. They traded fists for influence, violence for control. By the 3rd month, Derek's case went cold. Officially. Files were closed. Evidence boxed up. Interviews ended. But Benton didn't stop. He started asking questions outside the city. Old associates, union reps, small-time enforcers. That's when he heard it. A rumor about a debt being collected after a boy embarrassed Delgado's family in public. When he returned home that night, there was an envelope waiting on his doorstep. No name, no address. Inside was a single Polaroid photo, grainy, taken from a distance. It showed Benton's car parked outside Miguel's house. On the back, in smudged ink, were 4 words: "Let this one go." He didn't sleep that night. The clock ticked slower than usual, the sound of each second cutting deeper into the silence. He stared at the photo until the sun rose. Somewhere out there, a boy was gone. A father had crossed a line, and a city that prided itself on being safe had just shown its true face. Would you have kept digging if you were Benton? Would you have risked your career, your life, to find the truth about a boy no one wanted found? Or would you have done what most do, pretend the story was over, because it's easier to believe some things just disappear? But the truth doesn't disappear, it waits. It buries itself in silence until someone's careless enough to disturb it. And when that happens, it always comes back to collect. Detective Benton's hands trembled slightly as he stared at the board in front of him. Photos, receipts, newspaper clippings, every line of red string led back to one name: Anthony Delgado. He'd known men like him his whole career, men whose power wasn't loud but quiet, steady, institutional. The kind of power that didn't need to shout because everyone already listened. Months passed, the department moved on, but Benton couldn't. Every night, he drove by that diner, headlights cutting through the same cracked parking lot where it all started. He'd look at the flickering neon sign, the word "open" barely glowing, and imagine the sound of that slap. The way the diner must have fallen silent afterward. He could feel the echo of it, the humiliation, the fear, the moment everything shifted. One evening, while going through the diner's archived security footage again, the tapes that supposedly malfunctioned, he noticed something strange. A brief flicker, almost unnoticeable. A reflection in the window, a black sedan parked outside, engine running, 2 figures inside, one of them wearing a suit. Benton froze the frame, enhanced the image as best as he could. The plate wasn't visible, but he knew that car. He'd seen it parked outside Delgado Construction dozens of times. He called in a favor from an old contact in the DMV. When the registration came back, his heart sank. The car was registered to a holding company, one owned by Delgado's right-hand man, Marco Ruiz, a man with a record of assault, extortion, and witness tampering, but who'd somehow never spent more than 48 hours behind bars. Benton realized something then. Derek wasn't just another missing kid. He was a message, a warning sent in public, then buried in silence. And the police? They weren't investigators anymore. They were part of the cleanup. He visited Miguel again. This time the boy looked different, older somehow. He'd stopped going to school. His grandmother said he hardly slept, barely ate. Benton sat down across from him at the kitchen table. The air felt heavy, stale with the scent of coffee left too long on the stove. He spoke softly. "Miguel, you didn't tell me everything that night, did you?" The boy's hands fidgeted, eyes fixed on the table. He said something," Miguel whispered. "Before he hit me, he said, 'You people don't belong here.'" Benton nodded, letting the silence stretch. Then Miguel continued. "After that, I ran outside. I heard someone yelling, then tires screeching, and my father's cars, it was there. He told me to go inside. He said he'd handle it." Benton's chest tightened. "And did you ever see Derek again?" Miguel shook his head slowly, eyes glistening. "No, sir. But I heard him scream." That night, Benton sat in his car outside Delgado's estate, watching the tall gates and the guards stationed at every corner. He thought about knocking, about walking up and asking the man to his face what happened that night, but he knew better. Men like Delgado didn't confess. They calculated, and right now, Benton was a variable he hadn't yet decided what to do with. 3 days later, Benton received an anonymous package at the precinct. Inside, a VHS tape. The label read, "For your eyes only." He played it in the department's evidence room. The footage was grainy, time-stamped the night of the diner incident. It showed the parking lot from across the street. You could see Derek being shoved toward a car by 2 men in suits. One of them was unmistakably Marco Ruiz. The other, standing in the shadows, turned slightly toward the camera. Anthony Delgado. Benton paused the tape, his pulse racing. The boy's father had been there. Not hours later, not days. That night. He didn't send anyone. He came himself. He replayed the footage again and again, the car door slamming, the flash of Derek's terrified face, and then the frame cut out, static, end of tape. He took the evidence to his captain, laid it all out, the tape, the records, the connections. But by morning, the entire case file was gone. His access to the system was revoked. Internal Affairs opened an investigation, not into Delgado, but into Benton himself. The message was clear: stop digging, or you'll be buried next. That night, Benton found his tires slashed, his mailbox crushed, and a note taped to his front door. You've seen enough. For days, he didn't leave his house. Every car that slowed near his driveway made his heart pound. He knew they were watching, waiting, testing to see what he'd do next. But the thing about truth is, once you see it, you can't unsee it. It keeps you awake. It eats at you. Until you act. So Benton did what no one expected. He went public. Sent copies of the tape to local reporters, to a small independent radio show, to anyone who would listen. The story spread like wildfire. Mob ties in police department. Local businessmen linked to missing teen. The Delgado name, once untouchable, was suddenly everywhere. But that's when the real story began. Because Anthony Delgado wasn't a man who panicked. He was a man who planned. And as the city turned its eyes toward him, he started setting the stage for something far bigger, something no one saw coming. And by the time they did, it was already too late. The morning the headlines hit, the city froze. For the first time in years, Anthony Delgado's name wasn't whispered. It was shouted from every front page, every radio broadcast, every flickering television set in diners and barbershops across the state. The image of his face, sharp suit, calm eyes, no trace of regret, stared back from every screen. To most people, he was still just a businessman caught in a misunderstanding. To those who knew better, it was the first crack in an empire that had stood untouchable for decades. Detective Benton should have felt relief, vindication even. But as he sat in his car, parked outside the precinct, all he felt was a deep unease. Because when men like Delgado are cornered, they don't crumble, they retaliate. And retaliation always leaves blood behind. 3 nights later, Benton's phone rang at 2:14 a.m. The voice on the other end was trembling. It was Miguel's grandmother. "They're gone," she whispered. "I woke up. The door was open. And they're gone." Benton's heart stopped. He raced through the dark streets, sirens off, headlights dim. When he reached the house, the front door hung open, the lights flickering inside. Miguel's shoes were still by the door, his jacket still draped over the chair, but the boy and his father were nowhere to be found. On the table sat a single folded note. Benton opened it with shaking hands. It read, "A father protects his son. Always." The realization hit him like a weight in his chest. Delgado hadn't run. He'd traded. He'd made sure no one would touch him because he still had the one thing Benton couldn't risk losing. Miguel, the boy who'd seen everything, the boy who could destroy everything. For weeks there was silence. No ransom demand, no sightings, no bodies, just absence. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air. The story that once dominated the news slowly faded beneath newer scandals, newer distractions. Delgado's lawyers handled the press. His businesses continued operating, and the city, eager to forget, quietly returned to normal. But Benton couldn't let go. He followed every whisper, every lead. Until, 6 months later, he received an anonymous tip. A remote cabin in the woods north of Lake Hudson. He didn't call for backup. He knew no one would come. He drove out alone, headlights slicing through the fog, the air thick with rain. The cabin looked abandoned, boards on the windows, weeds clawing up the porch. But when he stepped inside, he smelled it. Coffee. Fresh. Still warm. Someone had been there moments ago. On the table, next to a half-empty mug, was a photo. It was Miguel, older now, standing beside his father, both of them alive, both looking straight at the camera. On the back, in the same handwriting as before, were 5 words. "It's better this way. A.D." Benton stared at that photo for a long time. The boy's eyes, the same ones that once trembled with fear, now looked hardened, not angry, just resigned, like someone who had finally learned the cost of survival. He left the cabin without saying a word. No report, no press release, no evidence. Because in that moment, Benton understood something he'd spent his whole life trying to ignore. Justice isn't a line between right and wrong, it's a currency. And men like Delgado, they've been rich for a very long time. Years later, after Delgado's quiet death from an apparent heart attack, the story resurfaced online. An old true crime podcast picked it up. Commenters debated whether Derek was ever really dead, whether Miguel had been complicit, whether the detective had been silenced. No one knew for sure. But in the final interview Benton ever gave, he said something that still haunts people today. He said, "We like to think evil hides in the dark, but sometimes it sits right across from us at a diner and smiles." And as for Miguel, no one ever saw him again. Some say he left the country. Others claim he took over his father's business quietly, keeping the same name but different methods. But if you ever find yourself in a small diner outside of Lake Hudson, and you notice an old photo hanging behind the counter, a faded picture of a man and his son, look closely. Because sometimes the past doesn't disappear. It just learns to live among us. Years have passed since that night in the diner, but the echoes never really fade. A slap, a scream, a silence. Moments that changed lives in ways no one could have predicted. Derek's name still lives in quiet corners of online forums, discussed by strangers who were never there yet feel like they were. They piece together theories, timelines, motives. But stories like this, they aren't puzzles to be solved, they're mirrors. Mirrors showing us what power, fear, and love can make people do when no one's watching. Anthony Delgado was a father, a criminal, yes, but also a man who built an empire not from brilliance, but from fear. And fear has a strange way of surviving. It passes down generation to generation until someone decides to break the cycle. Miguel never got that chance. Maybe he became his father's reflection. Or maybe he became his father's redemption. We'll never know. Detective Benton retired in silence. No interviews, no memoir, just a small apartment by the river and a single framed photo on his wall, a diner sign glowing in the distance. People asked why he kept it. He always gave the same answer. Because that's where truth started pretending to be justice. And now the story belongs to you. What do you think really happened that night? Do you believe justice was ever served? If you were Miguel, a boy caught between humiliation and revenge, what would you have done? Would you have stayed silent to protect your father, or spoken out, no matter the cost? Tell us in the comments. We're reading every single one. And if this story made you stop and think, if it made you feel something, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves stories that stay with you long after they end. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones that make us question our own choices. And if you thought this story was haunting, wait until you hear what happened in the next one, when a man's late-night favor for a friend turned into one of the most chilling confessions ever recorded. Subscribe now so you never miss what's coming next.